The station was called the Eternal Accord, and it floated in the dark space, above a gas giant that had no name, only a number in a star catalog nobody really used anymore. The gas giant was orange and brown and enormous, and the station above it was even more impressive. Massive ring of silver and gold metal, spinning slowly, full of lights and corridors and rooms where the most powerful beings in the galaxy came to talk and make rules and decide the fate of smaller civilizations. Ambassador LRA Vasquez stood at the window of her transport ship and looked at the station as her small vessel moved toward the docking bay. She was not a tall woman. She was not a physically intimidating woman. She had short, dark hair, brown skin, and quiet eyes that missed nothing. She had worked her entire career in diplomacy, starting as a junior translator at the age of 24 and climbing slowly, carefully, year by year, until the Secretary General of Earth had personally asked her to take this assignment. She had said yes without hesitating. Her transport was small, just a two-person crew and a single cabin for her. The Galactic Council had not offered humanity larger ship for this trip. That was already a message, and LRA had read it the moment the travel details arrived on her desk. She did not pack more than one bag. She did not bring advisor or assistants or security personnel. She brought herself one bag, a data pad, and a sealed encrypted message from the Secretary General that she was only allowed to open once she was aboard the station. The docking bay opened like a mouth and swallowed her ship whole when the doors behind her sealed and the pressurization completed. LRA picked up her single bag, tucked the data pad under her arm, and walked out into the Eternal Accord. The first thing she noticed was that several delegates were already there, watching her arrive. This was not normal protocol. Delegates did not come to watch other delegates get off their ships, but there they were, a cluster of tall, gray-skinned Velhari, standing to the left of the docking corridor, and two representatives of the KE Dominion standing further back, almost in shadow. One of the KE representatives said something quietly to the other, and they both made a sound that LRA had learned long ago was the Keth equivalent of a laugh. She looked at them and nodded once politely and kept walking. The corridor that led from the docking bay to the main residential level was long and curved slightly upward. The walls were made of a dark, polished material that reflected light in faint rainbow patterns, and the ceiling was high enough that even the tallest species in the council could walk comfortably. The whole station had been designed to make everyone feel welcome, which in practice meant it had been designed to make no single species feel like they owned it. But after 40 years of watching council politics, LRA knew that the Keth Dominion owned most of what mattered here: the votes, the committees, the informal agreements that happened in dining rooms and private lounges before any official session ever began. A young council aide met her at the end of the corridor. The aide was Amira, small, blue-skinned, with 4 thin arms and enormous amber eyes. The Marathi were efficient and professional and had served the council for over 3 centuries. They were also, in LRA's experience, very good at pretending not to have opinions. Ambassador Vasquez, the aide, said, "Welcome to the Eternal Accord. I am Coordinator Cell, and I will be your point of contact during the summit. Your quarters are on level 7. The negotiation summit begins in 36 standard hours. Thank you, Cell, LRA said. Is Elder V. Thorin already aboard? The aide blinked. A small hesitation. Yes, he arrived 2 days ago. LRA nodded and followed the aide to the elevator. Her room on level 7 was clean and functional. A bed, a desk, a window that looked out at the gas giant below. A small screen on the wall showed the current list of attendees for the summit. 17 civilizations. LRA counted the names and recognized all of them. She knew their histories, their economies, their old grudges, and their quiet deals with the K. She had read every file, every trade record, and every vote those civilizations had cast in the council chamber over the last 20 years. She set her bag down, sat at the desk, and opened the encrypted message from the Secretary General. She read it. Once she read it again, she sat very still for almost a full minute. Then she closed the message, put the data pad face down on the desk, and looked out at the orange gas giant below. She did not smile yet, but something behind her eyes changed in a much larger and much more comfortable suite on level 3. Elder V. Than of the Galactic Council was already holding a private meeting. V. Than was ancient by most species standards, over 400 years old, with pale violet skin and long white hair that he kept tied back in a formal arrangement. He had governed council proceedings for 90 years, and in that time he had overseen the integration of 11 new civilizations, the resolution of 4 interstellar conflicts, and the quiet elimination of 2 civilizations that had refused to cooperate with council directives. He was not cruel. He simply understood that the galaxy ran on order, and order required that smaller, newer civilizations understand their place. Sitting across from him was Executive Drax of the KTH Dominion, a broad, dark-scaled being with copper-colored eyes and the kind of stillness that made other species nervous. Drax was the Keth's lead diplomat and had been for 30 years. He was very good at making aggression look like generosity. She came alone, said one of Vethan's aides, a small creature standing near the door. Yes, V. Thorin said. He looked at Drax. The humans always send someone reasonable. They believe in the process. It is their greatest flaw, Drax said. They spent 40 years trying to be liked. They have not yet understood that being liked in this council means being useful to someone stronger. V. Thorin folded his hands on the table. The Accord of Mutual Limitation is ready for presentation. The language has been reviewed by all cooperating delegations. The Velhari have agreed to abstain rather than oppose, which is effectively the same as support the trade. Incentives we offered the Sauron and the Paladi were enough to bring them to our side. He paused. The humans will have no allies in that chamber. Drax made a low sound of satisfaction. And when they refuse to sign, they will not refuse, V. Thorin said calmly. They will protest, they will argue. They may ask for amendments, they will call for more time, and eventually, as they always do, they will negotiate. They will accept something slightly less terrible than what we first offered, and they will call it a victory. He leaned back in his chair. It is what they do. Humans negotiate. It is their identity. It is the thing they are most proud of. Drax looked at the door as if he could see through the corridor walls all the way to level 7, and if this one is different. V. Thorn considered the question for a moment. He had read LRA Vasquez's file. He knew her record. She was good, careful, and patient, and intelligent, but she was still one diplomat from a civilization that had spent 40 years asking for permission. She is not different, he said. She is just the latest one they sent to ask. Nicely, the meeting ended and the aides left and the station continued its slow spin above the nameless gas giant. On Level 7, LRA Vasquez was not sleeping. She was sitting at her desk, with her data pad open, going through documents she had already memorized. She was not nervous. She was not afraid. She was doing what she had done for her entire career. She was paying attention. But tonight, for the first time in a very long time, she was paying attention to something that had already happened, rather than something she was trying to prevent. The encrypted message from the Secretary General had not been instructions. It had not been a strategy document or a list of concessions or a diplomatic framework. It had been 4 sentences, and those 4 sentences had told her that while the Council was busy building a cage, humanity had already walked through a door that no one else in the galaxy even knew existed yet. She closed the data pad and finally allowed herself to smile. Tomorrow she would be polite. She would be patient. She would listen to every word of their well-prepared drab, and then she would say one thing that would change everything. The Grand Hall of Accord was the largest room on the Eternal Accord Station, and it had been built specifically to make everyone inside it feel the weight of history. The ceiling was so high it almost disappeared into shadow. The walls were carved from a single massive asteroid that had been hollowed out over 200 years ago. The seats rose in curved rows all around a central floor where the speaking platform stood, and every seat was filled. 2,000 delegates, aides, translators, and observers sat in those rising rows, and the noise of all of them settling and murmuring and arranging their materials was like a low wave of sound that filled the entire room. LRA walked to the human delegation's assigned position, a single seat and a single small table near the center of the floor level. There was no elevated platform for her, no extra chairs for staff who did not exist. She sat down, placed her data pad on the table, folded her hands, and waited. The session opened with ceremony, as council sessions always did. Elder V. Thorin descended to the speaking platform in long formal robes of deep blue and silver. He spoke for 12 minutes about the history of the Galactic Council, about the importance of cooperation and collective stability, and about the great responsibility that every civilization in the hall carried when it came to the shared future of the galaxy. His voice was smooth and measured, and the translation devices built into every delegate seat rendered his words in real time into whatever language each listener needed. LRA listened and understood every word in its original language. She did not need the translation device. When V. Thorne finished his opening remarks, he gestured toward Executive Drax, who rose from the Keth Dominion section, a wide, elevated block of seats that took up an entire quarter of the hall's upper rows, and descended to the speaking platform. Drax was impressive when he spoke. He had a deep voice and a slow, deliberate way of forming sentences that made everything he said sound considered and reasonable. He began by thanking the Council for the opportunity to present what he called a framework for lasting peace and shared prosperity. He spoke about the difficulties of managing a galaxy full of civilizations at different stages of development. He used Words like balance and sustainability and mutual benefit, he smiled, or at least made the expression his species used for a smile, and he gestured with his broad hands, and he was very, very good at what he was doing. LRA watched him the way a person watches a card trick when they already know where the card is. The accord of mutual limitation was presented clause by clause on the main display screens that hung from the ceiling, a document of 47 articles, each one carefully worded, each one designed to sound fair. The first article established mutual non-aggression, reasonable. The second established shared resource zones, reasonable on the surface, but the specific boundaries of those zones placed every significant mineral-rich system near human space under joint council administration. The third article capped independent military development for all developing member civilizations. The specific definition of developing applied only to species who had been members for fewer than 100 years, which at this moment meant exactly one civilization, humanity. Article after article, the cage taking shape in plain sight, dressed in the language of cooperation. When Drax finished presenting the document, he stood back and opened the floor to responses. The representatives of the 17 present civilizations began to speak in sequence, and what followed was 2 hours of speeches that LRA had essentially predicted word for word in her notes 3 weeks earlier. The Sarin spoke about the importance of stability and voted to support the accord. The Paladi spoke about shared futures and voted to support the Tharn delegation said very little but indicated they would not oppose the Velhari, the species whose colony worlds humanity had helped defend during the plague wars 11 years ago at significant cost in human ships and human lives, sent their senior ambassador to the platform, a tall, graceful being with silver fur and large dark eyes. The Velhari ambassador spoke beautifully about the complexity of galactic politics and the difficulty of choosing sides in matters of such great consequence, and then formally announced that the Velhari would abstain from the vote. The hall murmured. The Velhari abstention was not a surprise to V. Thorin or Drax, but it landed in the room like a small, quiet blow to anyone Clear's throat watching, who had hoped for different. LRA looked at the Velhari ambassador as he returned to his seat. The ambassador did not look at her. One by one the others spoke, and one by one they aligned with the council majority, with the document on the screens above them. Civilization after civilization that humanity had traded with, cooperated with, defended alongside all of them, finding reasons today to look the other way or to actively support the cage. By the time the last of the 17 delegations had spoken, LRA had counted the votes in her head. The accord had more than enough support to pass. Only remaining procedural step was for the human delegation to sign or to formally refuse. The room grew quiet in a particular way, the kind of quiet that happens when a large group of people are all thinking the same thing and none of them want to be the first to say it. Everyone was looking at the woman at the small table on the floor level. V. Thorin returned to the speaking platform. The Galactic Council now invites Ambassador LRA Vasquez of the Human Commonwealth to address the hall. LRA stood. She was not a tall person, and the grand hall was an enormous room, and she had no elevate platform and no dramatic entrance. She simply stood up from her chair and walked a few steps to the speaking position. She looked up at 2,000 faces of 17 different species, all of them waiting, all of them certain they already knew how this conversation was going to go. Some were waiting for her to protest and demand amendments. Some were waiting for her to give a passionate speech about human rights and the unfairness of the accord. Some were waiting for her to ask for more time. The KE delegation in their elevated section watched with the calm patience of people who had already won. Drax sat with his hands folded and his copper eyes fixed on her with something that was not quite contempt but was very close to it. He had done this many times before he knew the shape of this moment. He was waiting for the part where the smaller civilization accepted the deal because they had no other choice. LRA looked at Drax for a moment, then she looked at V. Thorin, then she looked out at the full hall, all the seats, all the faces, all the cameras and recording devices that were broadcasting this session lived to 40 star systems. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was calm and clear, and the translation devices carried it to every ear in the room. "Before I respond formally, I would like to check something on my data pad. It will take just one moment." There was a brief confused pause in the hall. This was unusual. This was not a normal thing to say at this point in proceedings. Some delegates exchanged looks. Some of the KE delegation shifted slightly in their seats. V. Thorne nodded graciously. "Of course, Ambassador." LRA walked back to her small table. She picked up the data pad. She looked at the screen. She stood there for about 15 seconds. Then she set the data pad back down on the table, and when she turned back to face the hall, something had changed in the way she was standing. It was subtle. Her shoulders had come back slightly. Her chin was a degree higher, but 2,000 delegates felt it before they could name it. She walked back to the speaking position and she smiled. The smile on LRA Vasquez's face was not warm, and it was not cold. It was the smile of someone who had been holding a secret for a very long time and had finally reached the moment where keeping it any longer served no purpose. 2,000 delegates stared at her from their rising rows of seats. The cameras drifted closer. The translation devices hummed quietly in every ear. Executive Drax of the Keth Dominion sat with his copper eyes fixed on her, unreadable. Waiting, Elder Vthorn stood at the edge of the speaking area with the practiced patience of someone who had watched hundreds of smaller civilizations give their final speech before signing something they could not refuse. LRA looked at the hall for one full second of silence, then she spoke. "We stopped asking permission 72 hours ago." The hall did not immediately react, because for the first 2 seconds the words did not fully land. The translation devices carried the sentence to every listener in their own language, but the meaning took a moment longer to arrive, because the meaning was not what anyone in that room had prepared themselves to receive. Then the noise started. It was not a single sound. It was 2,000 beings reacting in slightly different ways at slightly different times. Chairs shifting, whispered questions, a sharp exclamation from somewhere in the K section, the clicking sound they made when they were startled. The wave of noise rolled up through the rows and hit the ceiling and came back down. V. Thorin raised one hand for order, and the noise dropped but did not disappear. He looked at Lero with something new in his Expression not yet, alarm but the very beginning of attention. Ambassador, would you clarify your meaning? Yes, LRA said. She turned slightly so that she was speaking to the full hall. Rather than just to V. Thorin, I would be happy to clarify. She paused for exactly 1 beat. 72 hours ago, 3 human deep space shipyards that were built outside Council monitored space became fully operational. The first ships have already launched. They are not subject to the military development caps described in Article 3 of the Accord you just presented, because they were never built inside the zone where those caps would apply. She let that sit for a moment, then continued. 60 hours ago, the Human Commonwealth completed and signed bilateral defense and trade agreements with the Fenari Collective, the Dusk Worlds Alliance, the Orth, the Muravani, the Second Serenti, and the Pale Shore Confederacy. 6 independent civilizations who were not invited to this summit because this council considered them too small to matter. The noise in the hall rose again. V. Thorin raised his hand again. LRA did not wait for full silence. She kept her voice level and clear, and the translation devices carried every word. 48 hours ago, human escort vessels entered the trade corridors that the Keth Dominion has spent the last decade calling disputed territory. When KE patrol ships moved to intercept, they found human warships already positioned at every strategic point along those corridors. The blockade is over. It ended the day before yesterday. In the Keth section, Drax had gone completely still. He was not moving at all. He was the stillest thing in the room. LRA looked at him directly when she said the next part. In 24 hours ago, the Human Commonwealth conducted the final successful test of a transit drive technology that does not use the relay infrastructure that this council controls. Our ships no longer need your relay stations. We no longer need to pay the transit fees that have been the primary financial tool used to keep human expansion slow. We no longer need to request routing permission from any council body or any Keth-administered checkpoint. She looked away from Drax and back to the full hall. The relay monopoly that has been the foundation of council economic leverage for 3 centuries is, as of yesterday, no longer relevant to humanity. The Grand Hall of Accord was experiencing something it had possibly never experienced before in its 200-year history. Genuine collective shock. The noise had gone through 2 cycles and was now settling into something stranger. The noise, it was the sound of 2,000 beings processing information that did not match the reality they had walked into the room with. V. Thorin was gripping the edge of the speaking platform. He was not gripping it hard enough to look undignified, but his knuckles had changed color. Ambassador, he said, and his smooth voice had something rough at the edges. Now these are extraordinary claims. Yes, LRA agreed. They are also true. Every piece of what I have just told you has been transmitted simultaneously to the public information networks of all 40 council member star systems. It is being verified right now by journalists, independent analysts, and government offices across the galaxy. You are welcome to check. She walked back to her table. She picked up the 47 article Accord of Mutual Limitation. She held it for a moment, then she set it back down on the table face down. You built a very thorough cage, she said to the hall. You spent months preparing this document. You made deals with our trading partners, you convinced our allies to abstain, you isolated us carefully and professionally, and you brought us here alone, and you presented us with a choice between signing and being left with nothing. She looked at V. Thorne, and all of that was based on one assumption: that humanity was still the civilization. It was 40 years ago when we first joined this council. 40 years ago, we were new, we were learning, we were asking for things we did not yet know how to build for ourselves. She looked at Drax. You watched us very carefully for 40 years, she said. You watched us be patient, you watched us make concessions, you watched us ask for more time and accept smaller deals and work within the systems you controlled. And you decided that patience was weakness, that diplomacy meant we would always choose talk over action, that we would never reach the point where we stopped needing your permission. She let the silence hold for 3 full seconds. You spent 40 years waiting for humanity to stay small, she said. We spent 40 years learning everything we needed to make sure we never had to ask you for anything again. Nobody spoke. Drax was still not moving. The copper eyes that had watched her arrival with something close to amusement were now fixed on a point slightly above her head, as if he was recalculating something very quickly and needed to not be distracted. V. Thorin opened his mouth and closed it. He was 400 years old and had governed the most powerful political body in the known galaxy for nearly a century, and in this moment he did not have a procedural response ready because there was no procedure for this. There was no clause in the Council Charter for a situation in which a junior civilization had quietly made the entire structure of leverage irrelevant before the leverage was applied. One of the cameras drifted very close to LRA's face, and she looked directly into it. She was not performing, she was not being dramatic, she was just saying the thing that was true. The accord of mutual limitation will not be signed today, she said. Not by us, not in this form, not under these conditions. If the Galactic Council wishes to discuss genuine framework for cooperation, one built on mutual respect and actual equality, humanity is willing to have that conversation. She picked up her data pad in her bag. We know where the table is. She walked toward the exit. Behind her, the grand hall erupted fully and finally into sound, real sound, uncontrolled sound, the sound of 2,000 beings whose understanding of the current state of the galaxy had just been replaced with something completely different. And in 40 star systems, on screens and feeds and public networks, the broadcast was already being replayed. The 7 words were already everywhere. We stopped asking permission 72 hours ago. The first thing Elder V. Thorne did after the Grand Hall session ended was nothing. He sat in his private chamber on level 3, and he did nothing for 11 minutes. His aides stood near the walls and said nothing because they had learned long ago that when V. Thorne was still like that, it was better to wait. When he finally moved, he called for his senior analyst, a small, fast-thinking Myrai named Korath, who had worked for him for 60 years, and he said 5 words: verify everything. She said now. Corinth was gone for 34 minutes. When he came back, his face had the specific look it got when the information he was carrying was not what his employer wanted to hear. The shipyards are confirmed. Core said quietly, 3 construction. Platforms beyond the outer monitoring boundary, all 3 are already active. The first vessels launched within the last 4 days. The transit drive test is confirmed as well independent scientific. Observers in 2 separate systems have verified the results. The bilateral agreements with the 6 smaller civilizations were filed with their respective governments before this summit even began. They have been legally registered for 11 days. V. Thorin sat very still in the corridors. The Cath patrol ships withdrew, Korath said. Human warships are currently escorting 6 human colony transports through routes that were blockaded as recently as last week. The KTH have not engaged them. The room was quiet. How long? V. Than said slowly. Did they plan this? Core hesitated based on the construction timeline for the shipyards and the development timeline for the transit drive technology. Our analysts believe active preparation began approximately 11 years ago, the Plague Wars period, during the time when human ships were deployed to assist Valhari colony worlds. He paused when everyone's attention was elsewhere. V. Thorn closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about the file he had read on LRA Vasquez. He thought about every human delegation that had sat across from him in the last 4 decades. Patient, polite, always asking for reasonable things, always willing to wait, always willing to negotiate. He had read patience as a cultural trait. He had read it as the defining characteristic of a civilization that wanted to belong. He had never once read it as a strategy. They used the summit as a reveal, he said, not a negotiation. They never intended to negotiate. They came here to tell us what had already happened. Core said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. Across the station in a secured communications room, Executive Drax of the Keith Dominion was on a private channel to the Keth home system. The person on the other end of the channel was the Keth High Director, and the conversation was not going well. The military advisors had already run the numbers. The new human shipyards changed the production capacity equation significantly, not so much that humanity could match the KE in a direct conflict. Not yet, but enough that the cost of any military action against human worlds had increased dramatically. And that was before accounting for the 6 new allied civilizations that had just publicly announced their defense agreements with humanity. 3 of those 6 were in positions that would complicate any military movement toward human space. Their territories sat along routes that KE supply lines depended on. We cannot move against them without triggering a multi-front situation, one of the KE military advisors said on the channel. The allied civilizations were specifically chosen. They are not militarily powerful individually, but together, and in those positions they create a strategic problem that our fleet commanders are calling unsolvable without major losses. Drax said nothing. The transit drive is the larger long-term issue. The advisor continued, if humans no longer need relay stations, then within a generation their ships can reach any point in explored space without passing through any infrastructure. We can monitor or control the economic framework we built over 3 centuries was designed for a galaxy where relay access was the fundamental resource. Everything we built assumes that I know what we built. Drax said the channel was Quiet for a moment. Executive, the high director said from the home system, his voice careful. We need to consider a new approach. Drax looked at the wall of the communications room. He thought about the woman who had stood in the grand hall, the small, quiet woman at the small table who had come alone with one bag and a data pad and had said 7 words and walked out. He had spent 30 years reading civilizations. He had spent 30 years knowing exactly what a delegation would do before they did it. He had been wrong about this one, not because she had hidden her intelligence or her intention, but because he had decided before she arrived that he already understood what she was. He had seen patience and assumed limitation. He had seen diplomacy and assumed need. He opened a secure message channel to LRA Vasquez's quarters on level 7. He typed 4 words, "We should talk." Privately, he sent it and then he waited. The response came back in under 2 minutes. 3 words. "You know where?" "On the colony world of Nueva Esperanza. 11 light years from the nearest council relay station." A man named Danilo sat in a metal chair outside a converted shipping container that served as his home. He had a small screen propped against a water barrel and he was watching the broadcast replay for the 3rd time. He was 61 years old and had been on this colony for 19 years. His wife had left 7 years ago when the blockade made supply shipments unreliable and the farming cooperative he had helped build nearly collapsed. He had stayed because leaving felt like losing something he was not willing to give up. He did not have a good reason. He just stayed. He watched the small woman stand in the enormous hall. He watched her pick up the data pad. He watched the moment her shoulders changed. He had watched this particular moment twice already, and each time it hit him in the same place, somewhere behind the sternum, a kind of pressure that was not quite pain. When the 7 words came, he did not cheer. He did not shout. He sat in his metal chair outside his shipping container home in the dry wind of a colony world that had been quietly strangled for a decade, and he laughed. The laugh came out of him, unexpected and real, the kind of laugh that has been stored up for a long time before it finds its way out. His neighbor, a young woman named Sierra, who had been born on this colony and had never known what it felt like when the supply ships came on time, heard the laugh and came to the doorway of her own container. "Is it real?" she asked. She had seen pieces of the broadcast but had not watched from the beginning. "It is real," Danilo said. She sat down on an upturned crate and they watched the rest of it together. Back on the Eternal Accord, Elder Vithorin had finally moved from his chair and was standing at his chamber window, looking at the orange and brown gas giant below the station. Turned slowly, and the planet turned below it, and the stars did not move the way they appeared to move, but appeared to drift anyway. His most senior aide, a very old then who had served him even longer than Kor, stood near the door and waited. After a long time, Vithorin said, "Bring me the full diplomatic history of the human commonwealth from the beginning, every session, every vote, every agreement, every concession." The aide nodded and left. Vithorin stood at the window, and in his 400-year-old mind he began going back through what he remembered: every human delegation, every human request, every moment he had watched humanity, except slightly less than they asked for, and call it progress. He began looking at those moments differently now, not as a pattern of weakness, but as a map. He began to see one piece at a time, how every concession had been real, but had never cost humanity the things they had decided actually mattered. How every negotiation had been conducted honestly, but had always stopped short of touching certain areas, certain technologies, certain alliances, certain corridors of space that the human delegations had never pushed for loudly because they were already quietly handling them in other ways. The cage had been built carefully, but they had walked through a door that was never part of the cage's design because they had built the door themselves 11 years ago when nobody was watching. V. Thorne pressed one hand against the cold glass of the window and looked at the gas giant, and for the first time in a very long time, he was not sure what came next. 6 months passed. The new station was called the First Word, and it had been built by human engineers in 4 months at a point in space between 3 of the 6 newly allied civilizations. It was not as large as the Eternal Accord. It was not as impressive. It did not have asteroid carved walls or 2,000 seats or 200 years of history built into its corridors. What it had was clean lines and good light and meeting rooms that were designed so that no delegation sat higher than any other. Every seat at every table was at the same level. That had been a specific and deliberate choice by the architects, and everyone who received an invitation to the summit held there understood what that choice meant. Ella Vasquez was not alone this time. She walked into the main conference room with 6 other ambassadors beside her, the representatives of the Fenari Collective, the Dusk Worlds Alliance, the Orth, the Muravani, the Second Serenti, and the Pale Shore Confederacy. 7 civilizations who had spent years being quietly dismissed by the main council as too small to matter, and who had spent those same years watching humanity and deciding slowly and carefully that the humans were worth betting on. The Fenari ambassador was a tall being with pale green skin and 4 eyes who had personally approved the bilateral agreement with humanity 8 months before the summit on the Eternal Accord. She had done it without telling the council. She had done it by watching human colony ships struggle through blockaded corridors for 3 years and deciding she had seen enough. The Orth ambassador was old and slow-moving, but had one of the sharpest political minds in any of the 7 systems they represented. When the broadcast from the Grand Hall had reached Orth, the old ambassador had watched it once, called her government council and said, "We chose correctly." They took their seats on one side of the long table. On the other side, after a pause of about 4 minutes that everyone in the room noticed and nobody commented on, the Keth Dominion delegation entered. Drax was still their lead diplomat. He had not been replaced despite the failures of the summit 6 months ago, which told LR something useful about how the K evaluated their own people. They preferred someone who had been wrong and learned from it over someone new who had not been tested. She filed that thought away. Behind Drax came 3K advisors and 2 representatives of civilizations that had supported the original accord of mutual limitation. They did not sit quite as comfortably as they had 6 months ago. The broad section of raised seats they had occupied in the Grand Hall of Accord had no equivalent here. There was only the long flat table and chairs of equal height, and they sat down in them. The Galactic Council sent a Delegation 2, not V. Thorne himself, but 2 senior representatives and a team of advisors. The council's position had shifted in the month since the broadcast. The charter had been quietly revised twice. One of the revisions had removed the specific language that defined developing civilization in a way that only applied to humanity. The revision had been passed without much public comment, but everyone in political circles understood what it meant. It meant the council was trying to adjust to a world it had not designed. For LRA opened the session without ceremony. "We are here to discuss a framework for cooperation," she said, "not limitation. Cooperation. That word means something specific, and we would like to spend today making sure we all agree on what it means before we write any of it down." What followed was 8 hours of conversation. It was not easy. It was not always polite. The KE delegation pushed back hard on the transit drive technology, specifically on whether humanity would share access to it or license it or keep it exclusive. LRA's answer was honest. Humanity would share access with civilizations that entered genuine equal partnerships and would not share it with civilizations that were trying to use access as a new form of leverage. That answer made 2 of the KAT advisors visibly unhappy, but Drax himself was quiet for a long moment and then nodded in a way that suggested he had expected that answer and found it reasonable. The relay infrastructure question was the longest discussion of the day. The council representatives were most concerned about this because the relay network was not just an economic tool. It was also how emergency communications moved across the galaxy, how medical supply routes were managed, how response to natural disasters was coordinated. LRA had anticipated this concern and came prepared with a proposal. Humanity would help fund and build a parallel relay network using the new transit drive technology as a backbone, one that was administered by a joint body rather than by any single civilization or group of civilizations. The council representatives read the proposal twice and exchanged a long look with each other and then asked for 48 hours to consult with their governments. It was a reasonable request, and LRA agreed to it. At the end of the 8 hours, Drax stood and said he was prepared to sign a preliminary statement of intent to negotiate a new cooperation framework on the terms discussed today. LRA asked him if the KE government had authorized that statement. He said they had. She asked when they had authorized it. He said 4 days ago. She looked at him for a moment. You came prepared to sign today. We came prepared if the conversation went well. Drax said it went well enough. It was not a warm exchange, but it was an honest one, and in LRA's experience, honest was more valuable than warm. The statement was signed before the session officially closed. 7 signatures from the new alliance, and 2 from the KE delegation and 1 from the council representatives, who said their full authority to sign would come after the 48-hour consultation, but that they wanted their names on the page today as observers who intended to become participants. When the room began to empty, LRA stayed at the table for a moment, gathering her materials. A voice behind her said her name quietly. She turned. The speaker was the young Velhari diplomat she had seen in the corridor of the Eternal Accord the day she arrived 6 months ago. He was junior, too junior to have been part of the formal delegation at the earlier summit, but he had come as an observer today. He had large dark eyes and silver fur that had the slightly uneven color of someone very young. And he looked like he had been working up to this moment for several minutes before. He finally spoke. "We should have stood with you," he said, "at the summit. I know my government's choice. I know the reasons they gave, but I watched the broadcast and I have thought about it every day since, and I believe we were wrong." He paused. "I am sorry." LRA looked at him. He was very young. She remembered being very young in diplomatic spaces and feeling the particular weight of carrying an apology that was not entirely hers to give, but that needed to be said by someone. "Are you speaking for yourself or for your government?" she asked. "For myself," he said. "My government is still deciding what they think." LRA nodded. "Then I accept it personally, and I appreciate it." She held his gaze for a moment. "Stand with us now. What happened before is already part of the record. It does not have to be the whole record." He stood up a little straighter when she said that. She picked up her bag and walked toward the viewport at the end of the room. The others had mostly filed out and the room was quiet, and the viewport looked at it open, unmapped space, more of it reachable now than at any point in human history. The transit drive had changed the geometry of the galaxy in a practical sense. The distances were the same, but the cost of crossing them had dropped by a factor that made old navigation maps feel like documents from a different era. There were systems out there that nobody had visited, yet not because they were too far, but because the infrastructure to reach them had never existed, and now it did. LRA did not stand at that viewport and feel triumphant. She felt tired in the good way, the way you feel after a long piece of work is finished, not because the work was easy, but because it was real and it mattered, and it is done. She thought about Danilo on Nuva Esperanza. She had received a message from him 3 months ago. He had not known her personally, but had found her public contact through a government directory and had sent 2 sentences. The supply ships were running on time again, and he had started rebuilding the farming cooperative. She had read it on a Tuesday morning before her first meeting and had sat with it for a few minutes before replying. She thought about the 40 years of patient work that had made that possible. Not her work, the work of everyone before her who had built the shipyards and developed the drive and made the alliances and held their positions quietly when the easier path would have been to keep asking for better terms on a smaller cave outside the viewport. The unmapped systems waited. Humanity had not ended negotiations forever. They were going to negotiate many more times with many more civilizations, and some of those negotiations were going to be hard, and some of them were going to fail before they succeeded. But something had changed permanently, and everyone who sat across a table from a human diplomat from this day forward was going to know one quiet, settled truth: the humans across from them had already thought further ahead than the current conversation. Whatever they were agreeing to, they had already decided they could live without it, and whatever they appeared to be asking for, there was a reasonable chance they had already found another way to get it. That was not a threat. It was not a weapon. It was simply the answer to a question the galaxy had been asking without knowing it was asking. What do you get when a civilization spends 40 years being patient, not because they are weak, but because they are building. You get this. You get a station called the first word, and a table where every chair is the same height, and a door that opens outward.